All right. So at work, the interesting thing for when I was mucking around with Halogen yesterday to talk about basically this page and doing it in Halogen stuff, the interesting bit for me was if on the right-hand side, I'm signed in as like a viewer, and on the left-hand side, I'm signed as an admin. The admin has a little more options down here. Like over here, we've got the status that the admin can sort by. But the user, the regular viewer rather, doesn't have these options. And also, the admin has the ability to add the user over here as well, which is somewhat interesting. But the user obviously cannot. Again, based on who's signed in, options change, right? Like you want to present certain things differently. So I modeled all this in Halogen, and I was like, yeah, this is interesting. I was like, but how can I play around with this instead of, not actually, without having to sign in as a user with my entire instance up and like just mucking around with it? Like, can I do this? Is this a possibility? So that was the idea I was sort of playing around with in my head, and this is this talk, and it's going to be pretty darn short because I'm basically just building on top of what this one person ended up making, which was Flare over here, which is pretty interesting. So Flare is like a DSL, if you will, or an applicative DSL to build UI from basically you type these little things in, you give it little constructs, and it'll just build up a bunch of stuff. So for example, take a look at the basic one. So for example, you say, hey, I want a number. I want this function, the pow function over here. It needs to be a number. The label is called base, and 2 is the initial value, et cetera, et cetera. And voila, you get sort of like a UI, an interactive thing you can play around with, which is pretty interesting. I was like, oh, this sounds like fun. And later I found out also, well, anyway, we'll talk about the later stuff later. So I was like, how can I take this and can I plug this into my Halogen component? Because if I could do that, that would be pretty sweet, because then I could just play around with my component in sort of the virtual mode, if you will, to muck with it. And someone had beat me to that punch by like 2 days, which was a lot of fun, actually. There's this little project called Halogen Storybook, which is not quite the idea I was going for. But the idea was, on the left-hand side, you have a list of components, and on the right-hand side, you have your Halogen components that are there, right? So this was like, oh, okay. So basically, this person had basically embedded Halogen components in this list of components that you provide, basically. So I was like, that's a great start, right? So the next thing was to figure out how to plug in those things. And I will make this pretty darn big. All right. So I figured I'll have a little example component which doesn't do a whole lot of thing. It has its own state. It basically stores a bunch of clicks, records how many it has, right? Just something to play around with, nothing really fancy. And then once I have this base component, which is sort of like all users component, I was like, all right, I need to embed this into another, like a higher order component. So I basically have one over here where it just shoves things in. And the interesting bit over here, you'll notice, is the slot has an integer associated to it, an ID, if you will. And the reason will hopefully become a little bit more obvious later, in that the initial state, I've got the slot 0, and then when I receive some update from the external world, I go update that slot ID. And what that does is forces a redraw in that entire component. Because down here, if you noticed, in my component that I want to muck around with, on the receiving end, I don't care for my high-level component what I'm receiving from the top down. Your component might be different, and you can deal with this, but in order to force a redraw, you kind of need to change that the eq instance on the slot ID that's there. So I actually ran into that problem because originally I'd plugged in Flare. Yeah. Oh, sorry.
So you've got a normal Halogen component, right?
Yeah, down here.
You make like a container, like a wrapper to put around it,
right,
such that it can interface with Flare. That's the idea?
Yeah, that's the idea.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what's the requirements for the Flare? It just
Right now, you can't use it with 0.12.
What's the, no, but like the,
Sorry, what's that?
the type interface, like what type of interface?
I'll get to that in a bit.
Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, this higher order component, basically, every time it receives a message, it forces a redraw for its child component. That's all this thing does. Because you don't know what the heck the thing is going to do or not do. So in the example, for Flare, basically, you're sort of required to give an initial state to start off with, which is totally fine, right? Like, what starting value should I possibly have? And then you build your UI just in an applicative manner where I've got this record builder. Is that the right word, record? Record builder, basically, and just pumping it through Flare and saying, hey, I need a role name, blah, blah, blah. Just here, put all these things in this UI, basically. So before I get to the other part, actually, let me just pull it up. That can go away. That's basically what this ends up looking like. And so my Halogen component can have a bunch of internal state, but as soon as I change something, it forces a redraw down there and blows away that state that the Halogen component used to have, right? And so from my thinking, I guess, I was like, this would be an interesting way to just sort of, like that storybook thing, to showcase your elements and all the inputs it might have, and to sort of play around with it. So that was basically all I wanted to show. But I'll show the code over here. And that's sort of the main part of it is simply basically these two little bits, where over here I go run the Halogen component, I get that little input-output thing I can play around with, I can subscribe to queries and I can send things. So I basically use that over here and tell Halogen, hey, every time, basically this little function that's just a composition of query the action to send and the actual action to send to the higher order component. That's all that is. And down here I basically initialize Flare and saying, hey, whenever something happens, which is this little bit, because Flare's like, hey, I can give you the A that you requested from the UI, the type. And so once I have that type, then I just call handle state change, and it just forces the Halogen high order component to redraw. So it's nothing terribly fancy. I was hoping to generalize this a little bit more yesterday, like sort of going to the points that you were making earlier, like, you know, you have this config record. Can I get rid of it, right? Like, for example, I don't want to type any of this out. Like, I don't want an initial state. I want to construct all of this generically. And it turns out that the Sparkle library, where can I bring this up? So Sparkle is something that's built on top of Flare, which basically you just give it a function and it'll generate all the UI for that function. Right, so you can kind of play around with things. If that sort of makes sense. It's very funky and weird how it works, but the point is you can do it, right? So I was like, I'd like to leverage something like this in order to build that UI generically. And I dug around in the code, splunked a little bit, and turns out, actually, let me just bring this up in Pursuit. The Sparkle has instances for a row to list. And I was like, that's a great start. However, the row to list stuff is bound to, where'd it go? Where's the interactive bit? The row to list stuff is just bound to the data generic, which has sort of been deprecated, so it will no longer work in 0.12, and the recommended thing is to not use that data generic in 11.7 even. So I'm like, crap. I'd like to do this. I don't want to go derive all the generic stuff from my own stuff, but anyway, so that's where I'm at right now, and I'd like to spend some time and like learn more generic stuff myself, and I don't know, build on top of that. Yeah.
I don't know what they're doing. I mean, I don't know how much time you got to dig in there. Can that
Yeah, it probably can.
Just like a nice little pull request. It's like,
It probably can. I don't know enough about generics to do that though. Like I want to dig in and learn that, because once I do that, then sort of going up a couple levels, then I don't have to provide all the example stuff over here, right? Like I don't have to write all this code. Like it's already being auto-gen by that flammable row-to-list instance. But I need to change that generic thing. So anyway, that's the interactive testing bit I thought could be interesting, is that you could display these components and muck around with them. Even if they're hooked up to an actual server, that's even better, right? Because now you can have all these independently sort of constructed widgets, if you will, that can do all their side effects, interacting with the server, doing whatever, but you can set their initial states and play around with it. I don't know if that has value. I think it might be interesting. I don't know if it's like super useful. It'd just be good to get like some QA people at work to poke around with it and see if it's actually valuable for them. So anyway, that's that.